Here it is. A good exercise I like to do when writing test classes is to go down each line of code in the trigger and note what conditions need to be true in order for that line to run. Once I have a list of these conditions, all I need to do in my test class is make sure each condition has been met. Let me show you how I do this. Starting at the first line in our trigger, we have our trigger entry criteria. This trigger will only run if an opportunity is created or updated. I make a mental note that our test class will need to create or update an opportunity. Next line, we have our trigger loop. Whether it's one opportunity entering our trigger or 200, this line of code will run. No special conditions required here. That's one thing you should know about code coverage for loops. You only need a line of code to run once. You don't get bonus points if a line of code runs multiple times. This is a comment, which is good, but it's ignored in the overall code coverage calculation, so let's move on. This line of code creating our list will always run, assuming the loop is running and the trigger has fired. No additional conditions need to be added to our list. Now the next lines of code are interesting. We're adding field values from our opportunity into our list of decimals. Theoretically, all three of these lines will always run, but we do come across an interesting scenario if these fields are empty. Technically, these three lines will still run, but we'd be going against the spirit of our trigger if we left these fields blank. The trigger is meant to find the best competitor after all. So I make a mental note to populate the three competitor price fields. The next block of code, these 4 lines, are fundamentally the same as the block we just finished, except they use different fields. The outcome we want is to make sure these fields are populated. So, another mental note to populate the 3 competitor fields. Okay, so far in our test class, we know we need to do 3 things. Create or update an opportunity, populate the 3 competitor price fields, and populate the 3 competitor fields. Moving on to the next line of code. Our trigger is always going to create this lowest price decimal variable. Same for the next variable, lowest price position. There's no if statement surrounding these variables, for example, restricting them from running. So no new criteria to add to our running list. Now we have our for loop. This is where things get interesting again. Looking at the loop criteria, we see it begins when we set the I variable to 0. It runs as long as I is less than the size of the competitor prices list, and it increments I by 1 after each iteration. We need this loop to run at least once, so we have to make sure the loop criteria will match this. For example, if our competitor prices list has no values in it, the size method would return 0, and the variable I will never be less than 0, even in the first iteration when I is 0. That means none of the code inside the loop would run. So our test class must add at least one value to the competitor prices list. Luckily, this is already met by a condition we identified earlier when we said we were populating all 3 competitor price fields, each of which would get added to our competitor prices list. So we're confident at this point that our loop will run at least one iteration. Once our loop starts running, this next line of code is guaranteed to run. No new conditions to add to our list. But here we have an if statement. If statements are a leading culprit when it comes to missing code coverage. If you don't satisfy your if statement criteria, the code inside it won't run. So we need to make sure this if clause evaluates to true. Either our lowest price variable needs to be null, or the current price variable must be less than the lowest price variable. Let's analyze this. This if clause will be true if the lowest price variable is null. Looking back, we created the lowest price variable to be null. And as long as our for loop runs, the lowest price variable will be null at this point in the first iteration in our loop. So our if clause is guaranteed to be true at least once, and subsequently, the lines of code inside it will run. Again, no need to add any new conditions to our running list. Last line of code. This line isn't nested inside any if statements or loops other than our trigger loop. So as long as our trigger loop runs, this line will run. No new conditions to add to our list. So now we've analyzed every single line of code in this trigger and ultimately came up with 3 conditions needed for our test class. 1. Create or update an opportunity. 2. Populate the 3 competitor price fields. And 3. Populate the 3 competitor fields. We're ready to write our test class. The hardest part is already done.